I was just going to mention, in response to one of the statements of the Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Elections and Constitutional Amendments, that the post office is a part of the challenge that we have because of reductions in service at postal centers, processing centers, and workforce. So you can't do more with less. There's no such thing that I'm aware of, and that's a part of the delay. Also, mailboxes in some communities may still exist, but in large portions of the area that I represent are no longer outside on corners in the same distribution. So that's just something for members of the committee to be aware of, that the postal service has changed rather significantly, and it's anticipated that it will continue to evolve lest Congress invest significantly in it.
That's a very good point, Mr. Chair. Senator Hertzberg.
Thank you, Chairman Ridley Thomas and Chairman Allen, for doing these hearings. I really am excited about it. It's an issue that's been important to me for a long, long time. And, you know, the seriousness with purpose of you take with this, but I want to rant a little bit because I'm impatient. I'm unreasonable now. I don't like these hearings where we're all sitting there and we have an urgency. The level of think in which we are engaging is de minimis compared to what the level of the challenge is. The discussion about the post office. My son, who's a brilliant kid in New York at Juilliard, didn't know how to mail a letter and where to put it. Who cares? We're going to talk. We got the two of the youngest members of both houses chairing this committee, which is brilliant in terms of its an approach. But we're talking about yesterday. We're writing on stone tablets. These processes of mail and what we do and how we do it don't comport to how we live our lives. They don't comport to how we do commerce. They don't comport to how we communicate. I just got off a line with a fella who went online a year ago with an online newspaper and says he's losing readership to the Twitters and the instantaneous social networks. I don't know how to do it, but we have a fundamental commitment to this democracy. The reference was made earlier to the chairman's showing of Selma. People fought and died, and we're sitting here contemplating the margins. In my county, not in the north, you have a much better performance than we do. We know we had these horrible performances. As a lawyer, for many years, my view is, from a corporate perspective, you don't have a quorum in a corporation, you can't conduct business. If I could do it, I'd pass a law that says the election's not legitimate because not enough people showed to participate. There has to be a certain participation of the democracy. And that participation, as the Vice Chairman indicated, could be a statement that says, I don't like anybody or I don't want to participate. That's a fair constitutional statement. But I only suggest this as somebody, you know, I was the guy during Al Gore and Bush thing, came back to California to find that 53% of our voting machines were the same kind of machines that were the problems there, and put up the $200 million bond, obviously with the voters and everybody else, but sponsored it to try to get the machines, only to find out that the Secretary of State disqualified them in a number of counties. Thank God LA County hasn't spent their money. But, you know, at the same time, trying to do same-day registration, but Gray Davis only gets a 15-day. Now we're going to same day. The process, you have offices that have a constitutional mandate to count the votes of every single eligible voter in your county, and you have a small puny percentage of those human beings that show up. Whether government's cutting back those numbers because of it. Now, there's a second part of the trade. One's a systemic part, and one's our own mistakes about whether or not people either are educated to vote, want to vote, think we're all rat finks, and don't want to vote for us. But this is an urgency. I'm happy to be a part of this committee, and I'm ecstatic about this. But I sit here, and I will finish my rant, and I apologize. But I want to inject this sense of civic commitment. This has to be done immediately. We built the Pentagon in 13 months. This is a national crisis. This is an unbelievable thing. Now, are we going to ultimately, if we fix the system and make it perfect, and we remove poll taxes or remove literacy tests or other barriers that we've created, or other barriers because of our limitations of our imagination, creativity that don't match the imagination, creativity of the people who we want to inspire to vote, and we still can't get them to vote for a wide variety of reasons because we're not good at inspiring people or we've got to figure deeper, then that's the next step. But I only stop with this point, and that is the sense of urgency. the sense of commitment, the sense of gigantic importance of this committee, of this work it's doing, and I have complete impatience. It was Gore case 15 years ago, and we're still kibitzing about this stuff, and we're doing worse for whatever reasons. We went to 15 days. Villaraigosa gets 67,000 more votes in the LA election, 81 because of it. I tracked that. Those things are good, but it is not working, and we have to remove that, and we have to really have a deep sense of where the electorate is. Particularly, we have the older voters who are used to mailing, putting their mail and voting and stuff. But this number on kids is just, you know, I was there fighting for the 18-year-old vote as a kid, and now we're not turning out, right? So I don't know those answers, but I do think that the approach with which we approach this, the tone has to be the magnitude of its importance. And if we are successful in giving everybody opportunity and removing every barrier, then we've at least got to the first point. And I only share that with you because I've been in this fight for so many years, and I'm tired of it. And I'm tired of any complacency. And I'm tired of all the excuses. It just has to be done. End of issue. And I don't have an opinion on that.
Thank you, Senator. Speaker Pro Tem. All right. Well said. Well, really, sorry? Oh, yes. Sorry.
Thank you. So, Mr. Kelly, and I'm the vice chair on the Assembly side. So, Mr. Kelly, you made a statement when you were speaking about you on voting, you would like a secure, your quote was, a secure vote by mail system. What does that look like to you? That's okay.
I think certainly from the standpoint of making sure that the rolls continue to be looked at and to be as current, as up to date as possible, to ensure that when we mail ballots, they're going to the correct individuals, and that we're not mailing out live ballots to individuals who should not be getting them or who have passed on or who have moved. I think that, to me, really is the secure standpoint. Also, the return of those ballots is very important in making sure that the signature checking and that portion of how we process those ballots is secure. But my first point, I think, is the most important, and that is making sure they're going out to the correct people and that the rolls are absolutely as clean as possible.
Thank you. Ms. Scruggs, you, in your statement, said that most of the work takes place on the day of election for verifying signatures and everything that you have to do in one day, a lot of the work, the compounding work.
No, I misspoke if I indicated
that's what I heard. I
It's
apologize.
done ahead of time. An awful lot of ballots are turned in at that time that we can't get to on election day.
On election day.
You're right.
Okay, so I'm wondering about the legislation that was passed about the 3 days drop-off afterwards. How does that affect you?
Well, I'm a little bit, I think that will add a few more ballots that we can count. We go around to all post offices and pick up ballots on election day and the Saturday before and the Monday before. So there's 3 days that we go around and we pick them up so that they don't leave our county, and we get them in. So therefore, we're not missing that many ballots that are mailed on election day. And from our county, they have to travel to Sacramento, even if you're mailing across the street, and come back. So we're not missing that many by picking them up at the post offices in our county.
So it'd be beneficial if these ballots were postmarked
Yes.
by election day, even received after?
Yes.
Okay, just curious. And then, Mr. Schwab, I have a question for you. It's my last question, Mr. Chair, sorry. It's my understanding that California is the only state that does not have a statewide voter roll, and that every year we ask for an exemption from the federal government to have their indulgence to let us put together, and we are the only state out of 50 that does not have one. Where are we on that? Instead of 58 different ones, where are we, and what's the priority, and why aren't we there?
The VoCal system, which is going to replace the CalVoter system, is the top priority of the Secretary. It was the first meeting he took on his first day in office. And it's our looking at all the work and the facts and meeting with all the stakeholders that it's on track to be fully deployed by June of 2016. The first counties will be receiving, it will be rolled out in groups of counties starting in July of this year. So as those counties roll out and get VoCal, we'll be able to see how the rollout's going and anticipate the future of it. But everything looks good, and we hope to have it by next June.
Thank you. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you. Madam Vice Chair. Okay, well, really appreciate the panel, and our ears are still ringing with the rousing call from our colleague Senator Hertzberg, which I think was very well put. So thank you, and let's not be complacent. All right, we'll next hear from various research organizations. We have Wendy Underhill from National Conference of State Legislatures, Eric McGee from the Public Policy Institute of California, and Mindy Romero from the California Civic Engagement Project at UC Davis. All right.
It's 2:45, FYI.
Okay. We're first going to hear from Wendy Underhill, and we do appreciate your bringing your testimony with you. I guess you're in from Denver. Okay. And we're, first of all, very interested. Wendy's, we were not able to get someone in from Oregon to talk about some of the developments there. Both Wendy and Eric will be talking, I guess all three of you will be talking a bit, both about your individual research, but also some of the interesting models, particularly Oregon and Colorado, that we've been discussing a bit already so far. So we do appreciate the research you did to prepare for these, for this testimony you're going to be giving today. So we'll start with you, Ms. Underhill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. I am indeed Wendy Underhill, and I'm a program manager at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And NCSL is a bipartisan organization that supports the work of the legislators and legislative staff in all 50 states. My particular job there is managing the elections policy portion of the work. And one of those policies that I watch out for is vote by mail. And I would call that a slow-growing trend in the western part of the United States. I also come to you as a voter in Colorado and can discuss more specifically what's going on in Colorado with their mail elections and the other adjustments they made in 2013. So I will address three topics. The first is the growth in all-mail elections. The second is Colorado's experience. And the third is voter turnout in regard to all-mail elections. So to begin, I think you all know at this point that there are 3 states that mail out ballots to all voters, and that would be Oregon, which has done so since 2000, and Washington, which went all mail in 2011, and then Colorado, which adopted its current system in 2013. Alaska, Hawaii, Montana, Oklahoma, and Vermont have all considered bills in 2014 or 2015 to adopt all-mail voting as well. And in total, 22 states permit at least some elections to be held entirely by mail. Often these are left up to the local election officials to decide, and it might be for the smaller elections, such as special elections. And in some cases, geography plays a role. Large jurisdictions with very few voters sometimes can choose to hold larger elections entirely by mail as well. Or in some states, it's permitted to not run an election if there's only one candidate on the ballot. In the 3 states that currently send mail ballots to all voters, the history is somewhat similar. First, as with all states, they offered absentee ballots for voters who could not come to the polls on Election Day. And then they moved to provide no-excuse absentee voting, making it possible for any voter to choose to vote an absentee or a mail ballot. And then these states created a permanent absentee list, meaning the voter could request to receive all mail ballots for all future elections by mail. And the advent of these permanent absentee voter lists meant that voters could individually become vote-by-mail voters. And as each of these policies was adopted, indeed, more and more voters made the choice to receive and vote an absentee ballot. As the percentage of mail ballots rose, local election officials and legislators in those states began to wonder whether it made sense to run essentially 3 elections. First, the mail election for one sizable section of the electorate, then an early in-person voting option for others, and also a polling place election on Election Day for the remaining voters. And that led to the eventual adoption of all-mail elections in those states. I'll now shift to Colorado's experience specifically. And for this, I do need to acknowledge the help I received from Amber McReynolds, who's the Director of Elections for Denver, and also Jed Choate, who's Colorado State Election Director. And when I talked with both of them, they said that they would be happy to do anything of use to you all as you consider what options you might undertake in the future. When Colorado adopted a permanent no-excuse absentee voting list in 2002, approximately 10 to 15% of voters chose that option. By 2008, that number had risen to 50%, and by 2012, it was 70% of Colorado voters were on the permanent absentee list. Additionally, Colorado is where vote centers were first developed, so Coloradans are used to being able to vote at any vote center in their county, not just at the polling place designated for their precinct. And that's the background for Colorado's election overhaul that took place in 2013. That year, the legislature took up HB 1303, which combined a number of election changes into one package, including, as one of those items, sending a mail ballot to every voter. Because so many people were already voting by mail, the shift to what Colorado election officials call mail ballot delivery was seen as an evolutionary step and not a radical departure. HB 1303 also included the adoption of same-day registration, a change from a 30-day precinct residency requirement to a 22-day state residency requirement, authorization for voters to change the registration address within the state up to and on the day of the election, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, and the establishment of voter service and polling centers throughout the state to preserve in-person voting options during the early voting period and also on election day. Any voter could make use of any voter service and polling center in his or her county, and these centers could all access the statewide voter registration database so that poll workers could confirm in real time whether the voter was on the state's voter registration list and whether he or she had already cast a ballot elsewhere. In the first major election after that enactment in 2013, which was the November 2014 election, 95% of Colorado voters used the ballot that was mailed to them, and the other 5% went to the vote centers. The centers were open for any voter who preferred an in-person voting experience, for new voters who needed to register through the new same-day option, or registered voters who had not received a ballot because they had moved within the state. These voters could vote and update their voter registration information with their new address there at the vote center. And in Denver, 73% of those who did use the vote centers on election day did so because of an address change. The shift went well by most accounts. One reason that Amber and Judge Choate mentioned was that Colorado already devotes a good deal of attention and resources to voter list maintenance. Clean voter registration lists are essential to ensuring that ballots reach the right voters and that money isn't wasted on mailing to bad addresses. Without attention to clean voter rolls, as many as 25% of the ballots might not get to the voter. In those cases, election officials pay first to send a ballot out, then pay the return postage on the undeliverable mail, and then pay a third time to send it to the corrected address. So clean lists keep the costs down. Besides saving money on mailings, the clean lists also reduce the use of provisional ballots, and these ballots are required by federal law to be available to voters as a fail-safe option. So provisional ballots are expensive to process because each must be handled individually. The reduction in Colorado was stunning. In Colorado in 2010, there were 39,361 provisional ballots, and in 2014, there were 980. Colorado had at least 3 administrative practices already in place that helped keep the voter registration rolls clean. One was online voter registration, which had been active for 5 years. Voters not only register to vote online or on their phone, their tablet, or their computer, but they also can check their status and they can fix their own address through that same system. And in fact, of the transactions done through that online voter registration portal, only 1 out of 10 is a new registration and the other 9 are to update existing records. Second, Colorado follows up on all of the national change of address records to confirm that voters have moved. If it's been an in-county move according to the national change of address, then the registration is updated automatically. If it's an in-state or an out-of-state move, the voter is asked to confirm if he or she is still living in Colorado, and if so, given the opportunity to update the record. And third, Colorado participates in the Electronic Registration Information Center, also known as ERIC, and this is a multi-state data matching program. Participating states send their voter registration lists to the state-based consortium where all the lists are compared, and each participating state then receives back a monthly report of voters who may not have accurate records, at which point the Colorado Secretary of State provides those lists to each county, and the counties follow up on those records in the same way that they do with the National Change of Address records. The result of these list maintenance efforts is that the number of undeliverable ballots has dropped from 10% mailed out in 2010 to 3% in 2014. And I'm going to go off script here for a moment and say that there are a few other items that Amber and Judd mentioned, one of which is that by far most people do drop off their ballots rather than put them in the mail. It's 70% in Denver. And ballot design, or more specifically the envelope design, is a very important part of the project so that a voter can understand how to vote that ballot, what are the instructions for how to vote it. Denver also has a project called Ballot Trace that would address the questions that the vice chair had to some extent. The outside of the envelope, the outgoing envelope, has a particular kind of a code on it which can be traced as the ballot leaves the election office, goes to the post office, gets sorted out to the mail carrier, gets dropped off at the door, and then all the way back through. So the voter can actually see where the ballot is all the way there and back. And then the last thing I want to mention about Colorado is that they do indeed do a lot of the processing as they're leading up to Election Day so that the count can be a little quicker that night. So things are already all opened and scanned and properly arranged, and then those that have already been received can be counted quickly on election night. The point that Ms. Grubb made, that the ones that come in on Election Day, those still have to be opened and processed as well. Last part, turnout. It's hard to be precise about the answers about what makes turnout go up or down. We know, as you've pointed out here, that it depends on who are the candidates, what the campaigns are doing, the political culture of the state, and even the weather. Having said that, I can say that turnout did increase in Colorado for the November 2014 election as compared to the 2010 election. In 2010, 51.7% of the voting eligible population voted in Colorado, and that increased to 54.5% in 2014. And as has been mentioned earlier, Colorado had the third highest turnout in the United States after Maine and Wisconsin in 2014. However, that change cannot be solely attributed to the all-mail process. Colorado had hotly contested gubernatorial race and a Senate race, so the campaigns were running aggressive get-out-the-vote drives. And the move to all-mail elections was made concurrently with implementing same-day registration, and same-day registration has been shown to increase voter participation as well. So it's hard to separate out what was the effect of the all-mail election. And then as for Oregon and Washington, the other two all-mail states, they consistently have high turnout rates, and that's been true before they went all-mail, and it continues to be true. In the 2014 election, turnout in those states declined, but turnout, as we've noted here, declined all across the country to historic lows. So I'm not sure that that's a reflection on the all-mail elections in Oregon and Washington. Over the last 10 years, academic researchers have tried to tease out the effect of voting by mail from the other factors, and there is definitely room for more to be done on this front. It seems like common sense that to provide a ballot to all voters would reduce the hassle factor for voting and therefore increase participation, but that correlation is not proven, at least not definitively. One often cited work by Paul Gronke of the Early Voting Information Center, which is at Reed College in Oregon, shows that all-mail elections do increase turnout in small elections, such as municipal and special elections, but that the data are equivocal on whether there's an effect on turnout for the large elections. Oregon, of course, will be an interesting state to watch going forward. It was the first state to adopt the all-mail model, and earlier this month, as has been noted, it became the first state to adopt what we can call universal or automatic registration. And with that new law, Oregon's Motor Vehicle Agency will send to the Secretary of State's office a list of all Oregonians who have driver's licenses or state-issued ID cards, and those who are eligible to vote will be added automatically to the voter rolls. These newly enrolled people will be notified that they have been added and that given instructions on how to opt out of voter registration if they choose to do that. And they'll also get instructions on how to affiliate with a political party, again, at their choice. Mr. Chairman, I'll end there, and we'll be glad to answer questions from you or other committee members. And I'm also happy to take any assignments home with me for additional research in the future. And thank you.
Good. No,
Maybe
great.
I shouldn't have made that offer.
No. We are paying members of the national conference and of state legislators. So we're going to be looking for your help. No, because this is actually very helpful ultimately to hear what's happening. And we'll be asking a lot of questions about the Colorado model. So let's first go to Mr. McGee from the Public Policy Institute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished committee members. I work at the Public Policy Institute of California, where I'm a research fellow, and I study voter turnout and electoral and political reform more generally. So as we've all been discussing here today, California's voter turnout in 2014 hit record lows in both the primary and the general elections. So what I'd like to do is to put that turnout in some broader context and give some thoughts on potential solutions that we might consider. In so doing, I'm going to try to briefly answer 4 questions. One is, who votes and who doesn't? Second, what does California's turnout look like over time and compared to the rest of the country? Number 3, what are some of the reforms that have been tried in the past and how well have they worked in terms of boosting turnout? And number 4, what are other possible reforms out there that have yet to be tried in California? So number 1, who votes and who doesn't? The answer here is pretty much the same as in the rest of the country, except that in California is more extreme on some of the dimensions. California's electorate compared to the non-voting population is older, whiter, more educated, more rooted in the community, so less mobile, less likely to have moved recently. They tend to be homeowners. They're more partisan, so independents don't vote at the same rate that partisans do, generally speaking. And they tend to be a little wealthier. Generally, a lot of the difference in income between voters and non-voters is a function of being older and better educated for the voters, but there is still some residual effect of income on turnout. And then PPIC research by Mark Baldessari using the statewide survey has shown that voters also differ from non-voters in terms of their opinions. Voters tend to be less supportive of government action, of an expansive role for the government in public life. And then, of course, there's also the question of citizenship, which is a big deal in California. We have a lot of non-citizens and is a particularly important issue for the Latino and Asian American populations, but it's growing less so over time. The growth in those communities is almost entirely in the citizen population these days. So it's as time passes, that issue is going to become less and less relevant. Number 2, what does California's turnout look like over time and compared to the rest of the country? And for this, I'll refer you to the graphs that I passed around. California's turnout has dropped in the last 20 to 30 years. I think it's important to break this problem into 2 constituent parts. The first is registration, the registration rate among those who are eligible to be registered. And second is turnout after registration has already been achieved. So turnout among the registered population. Identifying which is the bigger problem, even if both can be problems, will help us to know sort of what problems to target. Compared to other states, if you look at Figure 1, California's registration rate has been slipping. Figure 2, turnout among the registered has actually been holding up pretty well compared to other states, relatively speaking. And over this period of time has been consistently higher than in other states. So again, if you look at midterms there, it is declining even among the registered, but it's all looking relatively better than the registration rate picture. Now, I want to be clear, that's not to say that turnout among the registered is fine. If you look at the absolute numbers, even if you look to a certain extent in terms of the relative numbers, it's definitely declining, and that's especially true outside of presidential elections. But I'd like, moving through the rest of this presentation, I'd like to focus on the registration piece a little bit more, because registration may be sort of the quote-unquote easier problem to tackle in the sense that it's most amenable to broad policy change, whereas for reasons I'll just touch on briefly at the end, turnout among the registered, a lot of that is going to be outreach. So question 3, what are some of the reforms that have been tried in the past and how well they worked? In a report last year, I looked at the performance of 2 of California's reforms that have been adopted recently in particular. One is online registration, and the other is conditional registration, same-day registration, whatever you want to call it. So online registration was evaluating sort of its maiden voyage in California, and the results suggested that online registration may have ticked up the registration rate just a little bit, but most of the people who use the system, and again, a lot of people use the system, so it's very popular, were already planning on registering anyway, and they registered earlier in the cycle because there was this exciting new opportunity to use the online system. Conditional registration, that's a matter of looking at other states because we haven't implemented it in California yet. And it definitely gets used a lot in other states, depending on the state. You know, it can be a huge share of the population uses that system every cycle. The problem is that most of those people are people who would have participated anyway, and they're just doing it later. So in terms of getting new voters to the polls, I think there's a range of estimates in terms of the effect of same-day registration, but it generally maxes out at about maybe 4 or 5 percentage points higher. So it's not nothing, but it's important to keep them in perspective. I think one of the challenges for California is that we are a significantly larger state than any other that has attempted or adopted same-day registration. So, for instance, LA County alone is 40% larger by itself than the largest state that has adopted an online registration system, which is Wisconsin. So the number of eligible people in LA County exceeds the number of people in Wisconsin. So we need to be prepared for what could be a large surge of people, and things are administered at the county level, which in these other states means a very small county with very few people. In California, it could potentially be a large number of people and a much larger administrative challenge. So we need to be prepared for that. What are other reforms that have yet to be tried? The one that I would really like to put on the table here is one that people have been talking about, and that's the automatic registration. I promoted that in the report from last year. Again, this is just a matter of taking people who have engaged with government in other respects and provided enough information to be registered to vote, making sure that that information gets transmitted automatically to the Secretary of State and that they get put on the rolls by default. And then they can opt out. You send a message to them. This is what Oregon is doing. Send a message to them, give them the option to opt out, ask them what kind of party they want to be registered with, you know, deal with all those sorts of niceties. But generally speaking, putting them there and assuming that they're there unless they ask otherwise. Would this solve California's turnout problem? No, because registration also reflects a certain amount of engagement with the process. For example, North Dakota has no voter registration at all, but it falls significantly short of 100% turnout every 2 years. So automatic registration would need to be followed up with constant engagement and outreach to get people to the polls. So I think automatic registration is a great way to bring everything to a level of simplicity, but you still have to do that outreach. I will also say that I think automatic registration could help with the issue that I was raising earlier, that we have these very large counties that have to administer the same-day registration system. It would essentially be putting everybody on the rolls by default, and you would eliminate most of the any concerns you might have about that surge right before Election Day. So it could be a great administrative tool in that sense.